What would you do if you were at 20,000 feet, with fuel running out, the enemy surrounding you, and a friend screaming over the radio that he's going to die? Some would say nothing to do, but in March 1967, an American pilot named Bob Pardo proved that the impossible can be pushed literally. He didn't just save two comrades in the middle of Vietnam's hell, he rewrote the laws of aviation. And what he did that day was so insane, so improbable, that even today engineers say that shouldn't have worked. Stay with me and see what a human being is capable of when they risk everything to save another. The sun was rising over northern Vietnam, tinting the horizon red. Down below, the Thai Nguyen steelworks roared with anti-aircraft fire. It was one of the country's most fortified strongholds, surrounded by automatic machine guns and newly arrived Soviet missiles. 4 American F-4 Phantom II jets flew in formation to attack the complex. Among them were 2 men, Captain Bob Pardo and his partner, First Lieutenant Steve Wayne, in the lead Phantom. Right behind was Captain Earl Arman, with Lieutenant Robert Horton as navigator. The plan was simple: go in fast, bomb, get out before hell woke up. But in Vietnam, nothing was simple. Minutes later, the enemy sirens began to wail. North Vietnamese radar had picked them up. A tangle of traces crossed the sky like fire snakes. The mission turned to chaos. "Watch out, multiple SAMs," shouted a pilot over the radio. Arman's F-4 was the first to be hit. A flash, an explosion in the fuel tank. "Losing power, fuel leaking," echoed his voice, trembling. The jet kept flying, but time was against them. The flames escaping the tank betrayed their route. If they ejected there, they'd be captured, and no one survived long on enemy soil. Command at the base didn't respond. Communications were cut off. The decision was in the pilot's hands. Pardo looked at the horizon, saw the black trail of the friendly plane dragging behind, and something inside him refused to accept it would be just another dot vanished from the map. "Earl, hold on tight. I'm coming." The response came confused. "Are you crazy? Get back to base." But Pardo wasn't listening to orders. He was listening to instinct. He reduced speed and began to approach. Ahead, Arman's Phantom wobbled like a wounded bird. Altitude was dropping. The fuel leak was desperate. They were at 20,000 feet, still over enemy territory. The only possible refuge was Laos, almost 140 kilometers to the west. If they could reach the border, they could eject safely. The problem was that Arman's jet wouldn't make it that far. The math was crawl, without engines, in minutes they'd be dead. And then, amid the chaos, Pardo had an idea so absurd that Steve Wayne thought he was delirious. "I'm going to push them." The radio silence lasted long seconds. "You're going to what?" replied Arman, incredulous. "Or I push, or they fall." No one had ever tried anything like that. Pushing a jet fighter with another was impossible. The engines, the turbulence, the speed difference, everything conspired against it. Any wrong touch and both would explode in seconds. But Pardo believed he could try. He'd seen the impossible many times in the war, and he knew the impossible just needs someone who refuses to give up. He aligned his Phantom right below the wounded plane. The heat from the flames reflected on the windshield. The smell of kerosene invaded the mask. For the first time, Pardo felt fear, but he also felt something stronger: responsibility. "Hold on tight, Steve. We're going to push a plane through the sky." The first impact was brutal. The nose of Pardo's Phantom hit the rear of Arman's plane, where the drag chute compartment was. The shock was so strong the whole jet shook. Pull away," shouted Wayne. The contact broke. Both nearly lost control. But Pardo didn't give up. He tried again and again, until he realized there was an alternative. "Earl, lower the tailhook." The tailhook, the landing hook used for carrier landings, could serve as a contact point. Arman complied, and the hook descended, swinging in the turbulent air. Pardo carefully aligned the nose of his fighter to the hook, like fitting a key into a lock. And for an instant, the impossible happened. The two planes touched and stayed stable. Pardo felt the tremor vibrate through his whole body. The fuselage creaked, the engines roared, the panel flashed like a collapsing Christmas tree. He began to push millimeter by millimeter. Down below, Vietnam burned. Up above, 2 Phantoms defied physics. And Pardo's push had just begun. On enemy radars, the operators couldn't believe it. A bright dot seemed to carry another through the air. The generals called it a reading error, but it wasn't an error. It was will. It was one man pushing another jet fighter through sheer determination. And what he was about to do would go down in history as the Pardos push, the push that proved that sometimes war isn't won with force, but with heart. The silence inside the cockpit was almost as deafening as the turbine roar. Pardo and Wayne knew they were trying something no one had ever attempted. The damaged plane's tailhook swung in the air, vibrating with turbulence, while the nose of Pardo's fighter approached slowly, inches away. A gust of wind could end it all. Slower, slower, murmured Steve Wayne, watching the panel shake. Pardo kept his hands steady on the stick, his eyes fixed on the hook that seemed to dance in the air. Then finally, the moment when two planes became one. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the wounded Phantom stopped falling. The force of Pardo's thrust kept it in the air. It was almost imperceptible, but it was happening. He was pushing another jet fighter through the sky. Wayne let out a sigh between incredulous and terrified. My God, this is working, but the price was high. Pardo's left engine was already shaking at its limit, and fuel consumption was skyrocketing. Every minute cost precious liters and brought the two closer to death. Still, he continued. At 15,000 feet, the heat inside the cockpit was over 60 degrees. Sweat streamed into his eyes, the helmet weighed like lead. Hang in there, Bob, said Wayne, his voice hoarse over the intercom. Up ahead, Arman tried to keep the plane stable, but control was almost nil without power. The fighter depended entirely on the force coming from behind. It was like pushing a burning car uphill against the wind, with the ground cracking underfoot. Every touch was a fight. Sometimes the hook slipped, hit Pardo's windshield and sparked. The two planes separated, wobbled violently, then realigned. Pardo instinctively calculated the thrust needed to regain contact, adjusting the engines like a conductor leading a symphony of destruction. 1 second's mistake, and both would turn into a fireball in the air. On the radio, the breathing of the four men was the only constant sound. None of them knew if it would last 5 more minutes or 5 seconds. From the ground, anti-aircraft batteries tried to guess what they saw: 2 fused dots on radar, a phenomenon even the analysts couldn't identify. Pardo looked at the panel. Fuel was dropping fast. Every time he adjusted thrust to maintain contact, he burned hundreds of liters. It was a race against time and against physics itself. He tried to ease the tension with humor, a rare kind of courage that only appears when fear no longer makes sense. Steve, he said, when we land, promise you'll pay for the gas? Wayne laughed nervously. If we land, I'll pay for the whole bar. The distance to Laos was still huge. The sky seemed to drag on. The left engine started coughing, pressure dropped, and vibration ran through the entire fuselage. We're losing an engine, warned Wayne. I can't stop, replied Pardo, jaw clenched. He reduced power on the right engine and increased the angle of attack, trying to balance the dead weight ahead. The aircraft groaned. Pardo's hands trembled on the stick, but his eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. Just a little more, he repeated, as if the phrase itself were fuel. Down below, the Vietnamese jungle seemed an endless green sea, a sea that silently waited for the carcasses of the two planes. Bob, we're over Laos, shouted Arman. Pardo looked at the altimeter. They were under 10,000 feet. A few more kilometers and you can eject safely. He pushed once more, the hook hit hard, sparks flew, but he held the pressure. The left engine died. The fuel needle was hugging zero. Even so, Pardo continued, now with one engine, pushing tons of metal against gravity. It was like carrying a wounded friend on his shoulders while the ground collapsed. Time seemed distorted. The panel shook, the radio crackled, and every second was an eternity. Until suddenly, Arman announced, we're ready to eject. Pardo released the thrust, veered gently, and watched the other Phantom glide for a few seconds before losing lift. 2 white parachutes opened in the sky. Seconds later, he and Wayne did the same. Floating under the golden sun, they watched the jungle below an ocean of green that, by miracle, wouldn't be their tomb. When they touched down, the silence was absolute. Only the distant sound of rescue helicopters cut the air. Pardo looked at the sky and murmured, half laughing, half incredulous, we pushed the impossible. It was the first time he realized the magnitude of what he'd done. He'd turned the most irrational act into an eternal lesson in courage. Hours later, all were safe in Allied territory. 4 men, exhausted, covered in mud, but alive. And as they walked to the helicopter, Airman turned to him and said, "You know this will never make it into the manual, right?" Pardo replied, with a half smile, "Good thing. The impossible had been done." But the price of audacity was yet to come, because when they got back to base, the hero wouldn't be greeted with applause but with questions. The helicopter landed amid dust and wind. When Bob Pardo stepped down, there were no applause, no hugs, no smiles, just silent, suspicious stares. Air Force Command didn't know what to do with the man who'd challenged every rule. To some, he was a hero who'd saved lives. To others, a reckless pilot who'd risked a multi-million-dollar jet. The feat seemed too big to fit within military discipline. Back at the base in Ubon, Thailand, Pardo was separated from the others and taken for interrogation. Officers with clipboards, cold expressions, and measured voices bombarded him with questions. They wanted to know everything: the speed, the angle, the altitude, the exact point of contact between the planes. "Did you have authorization?" they asked. He answered, "No, why risk it?" Because they were still out there. No technical calculation could explain that gesture. And maybe that's exactly what bothered the superiors most, the fact that he'd acted out of humanity, not protocol. Meanwhile, Airman and Horden, the saved pilots, did what they could to defend their friend. They sent reports, letters, and testimonies. They described what they'd seen in the air, the nose of Pardo's Phantom pressing against their landing hook, keeping them flying for nearly 20 minutes. An act of precision, courage, and instinct. But for the military hierarchy, it wasn't enough. War is made of orders, and Pardo had broken one. The following days were a limbo. He kept flying minor missions, but the silence around the case was heavy. Some pilots came to shake his hand in secret, with looks of respect. Others averted their gaze, fearing being seen with him. And yet, Pardo kept his composure. There was no regret, just a silent certainty. "I'd do it all again." At night, he returned to the barracks and looked at his hands, the same ones that had gripped the stick while pushing a plane through the sky. He thought of Airman, Horden, and Wayne. He thought of the moment the 4 parachutes opened over Laos. No medal, no regulation could have more value than that. Over the weeks, the story began to spread through the air bases. First as a rumor, then as a whispered legend. "Did you hear what the guy did? Pushed another Phantom with his own plane." Young pilots sought him out discreetly, asking for details. They wanted to know how he'd done it. Pardo smiled and said, "I don't know if I did it. I just know it worked." In short order, the name, the Pardo's push, began to circulate. No one knew who coined the phrase, but it stuck. Pardo's push became synonymous with courage and loyalty. It was told in mess halls, in hangars, and even on base internal radios. Some planes received discreet inscriptions on the fuselage, "Push it, Pardo." It wasn't rebellion, it was gratitude. But command didn't see it that way. An individual act couldn't become a myth bigger than the system. And for years, the feat was recorded only in cold reports, without decoration, without recognition. Still, time did what time always does, turned what fear tries to erase into memory. Pardo continued serving, completing missions, teaching new pilots, and never boasted about what he'd done. He avoided interviews, avoided drawing attention. When asked, he just said it was just another day, only with less fuel and more stubbornness. Years later, reporters began to unearth the story. Articles appeared in aviation magazines. Experts tried to recreate the maneuver in simulators, none succeeded. One engineer even said, technically, that wasn't possible. But Pardo had done the impossible because the calculation that guided his hands didn't come from a manual, but from a simple principle: you don't abandon a friend. And when asked if he wasn't afraid of dying, he smiled faintly and said, "Of course I was. But fear is fuel too, as long as you know how to use it." Gradually, the American Air Force realized there was no way to silence a story that had already become a symbol. Pardo's push wasn't just an aerial feat. It was a metaphor, a reminder that even amid war, there were still gestures that made us human. And as the years passed, that story born of madness and compassion began to move again, slowly, as if still being pushed by the wind. Not by the engines of a Phantom, but by the memory of those who heard it and never forgot. Official recognition would still take decades to arrive, but respect that had been flying long before. Because in the hearts of pilots, Bob Pardo's push was no longer an event. It was a code of honor. The following decades were quiet, but silence is never neutral. As Vietnam headlines faded from newspapers and the country tried to erase the scars, the Pardo push story lived on in the corridors of air bases. It was told among veterans, remembered on long nights, in smoky bars full of nostalgia. "Remember the guy who pushed a plane with another?" they said, like talking about a miracle. Bob Pardo didn't seek fame. He continued serving, now as a flight instructor, training young pilots who might never imagine they were learning from the man who defied gravity and rules. Time, however, has a habit of correcting what bureaucracy tries to bury. In 1989, more than 20 years after that day over Vietnam, a group of veteran officers submitted a formal request to review the case. One of them, who'd witnessed the maneuver over the radio, wrote, "If that man had followed orders, 4 soldiers would be dead." It was the start of a turnaround. The documents, once locked in drawers, came to light. Testimonies were reviewed, and the final report acknowledged what human instinct already knew: Bob Pardo's act wasn't recklessness. It was pure heroism. That summer, Pardo was invited to a ceremony at a Texas base. He arrived in a simple suit, a discreet smile, and the same steady hands that one day had pushed the impossible. By his side was First Lieutenant Steve Wayne, his old cockpit partner. When their names were called, the entire hangar stood. The two received the Silver Star, one of the United States' highest military honors. The medal gleamed under the midday light, but the important shine was in the eyes of the young cadets watching them, guys who'd grown up hearing that story like it was legend. Pardo took the stage with slow steps. The silence was almost sacred. He looked at the officers in front and the veterans in the back rows and said only, "Sometimes, duty isn't in the manual. It's in the heart." Those words hung in the air for a few seconds, as if the hangar itself breathed with him. It was a simple phrase, but it held everything: courage, stubbornness, love for life, and the weight of someone who'd already faced the impossible head-on. After the ceremony, a young pilot approached and asked, "Sir, how did you know that would work?" Pardo smiled, put his hand on the young man's shoulder, and replied, "I didn't know, but if I'd waited to be sure, they would have died." From then on, the Pardo's push stopped being just a story told in whispers. It became part of Air Force training. Instructors started using it as an example of leadership and loyalty. In military ethics classes, the phrase "don't abandon anyone" took on new meaning. It was no longer about battlefield bravery, but about humanity, the kind of courage born when logic says no and the heart says go. Specialized magazines began publishing detailed articles on the maneuver. Engineers analyzed the feat in flight simulators and reached the same conclusion: there was no way to explain it. Physics said the planes should have collided, that the thrust wouldn't be enough, that lift would be lost. But against all reason, it worked. Science called it chance. Pilots called it faith. In the following years, Pardo became a constant presence at aviation events, not out of vanity, but a sense of mission. He said the story wasn't about him, but about what humans are capable of when fear bows to compassion. "What I did wasn't genius. It was necessity. And sometimes that's what makes us better than the circumstances." With each decade, the myth grew. Documentaries, TV shows, and museums began mentioning the feat. But what kept Pardo's push alive wasn't glory. It was what it symbolized: a reminder that war, even covered in ashes, can still reveal gestures of light. Pardo aged with tranquility, but humility never left him. Whenever called a hero, he shook his head and said, "The heroes were the ones I pushed," and maybe it was true. Because, deep down, the greatness of his act lay exactly in that doing the impossible without wanting to be remembered for it. As life went on, Bob Pardo's name was beyond medals and manuals. It became a kind of prayer among pilots, a silent code. Something said before takeoff, quietly, almost in secret: "If Pardo could push a plane, I can push luck." The Air Force, which once called him insane, now taught him as an example. And in every classroom, among disassembled engines and flight panels, the story gained new life. Because more than a maneuver, the Pardo push became an eternal reminder that heroism sometimes isn't attacking, it's sustaining. Years passed and the world changed. Planes became faster, was more silent, skies more technological. But amid all the advances, there was something that couldn't be replicated in labs or algorithms: the human heart that powered the Pardo push. The story began to cross generations. Young pilots who'd never heard the sound of a phantom jet learned the name Bob Pardo like learning a prayer. In every air academy, instructors told the story with the same reverence as speaking of a miracle. When everything seems lost, they said, remember, he pushed another plane. In aviation museums, there's a black and white photograph hanging on a polished aluminum wall. Two F-4 Phantom fighters flying side by side, one almost touching the other. The caption is simple: the Pardos push Vietnam 1967. Many pass hurriedly, but those who stop before that image feel something different. Because it's not just a photo, it's testimony that even in the heart of war, there's still room for gestures of humanity. One man pushing another not to win, but to save. Bob Pardo lived long enough to see his story become a symbol. He never sought fame. He lived with the same serene gaze of someone who challenged the impossible and survived. When asked what he'd felt that day, he replied, "It was the only flight where I didn't think about the war. I just thought about not leaving anyone behind." Those words became the perfect summary of who he was, a man who turned the brutality of war into a lesson on loyalty. Over time, his feat began to be taught not just in aviation schools, but in leadership lectures, corporate training, and even universities. Because the Pardo push transcended the cockpit, it became a metaphor. A living reminder that in any field of life, there's always someone needing a push to cross the border of the impossible. And that courage sometimes isn't running toward danger, it's standing firm to sustain someone who's falling. When Bob Pardo passed away in 2024, at 89 years old, a squadron of modern fighters flew over the Texas cemetery where he'd be buried. High above, in a symbolic gesture, one of the planes shut off its engine for a few seconds, gliding silently. It was a tribute, the last push. The formation commander broke protocol and said over the radio, "Bob, now we're the ones pushing you." Below, the veterans raised tearful eyes. The cycle had closed. In the following months, videos and reports multiplied across the internet. Young people who'd never lived through Vietnam wrote on social media, "Push it, Pardo." The phrase became a motto, a tattoo, a squadron name. Because the story had stopped being just memory now, it was a symbol of an ideal. That true victory isn't in taking down the enemy, but in lifting another when they're about to fall. And there's something deeply eternal in that gesture. War tries to dehumanize. It turns faces into numbers, men into targets. But that day, in 1967, amid the fire, Bob Pardo proved it was still possible to be human. That love for life, friendship, and loyalty could conquer fear and even physics. The sound of his engines may have been lost in time, but the echo of his act continues crossing generations. Today, in flight simulators, instructors still repeat, "Never leave anyone behind." Some discreetly place an image of the two phantoms on the wall. Others tell the story to remind new cadets that the sky isn't just a battlefield, it's a mirror. And the reflection we leave in it is what defines who we really are. Bob Pardo didn't just push a plane. He pushed the concept of humanity into war. He showed that courage isn't shouting orders amid chaos, but acting when everyone thinks it's over. And he proved, definitively, that the impossible is only impossible until someone refuses to believe it. The Pardo push continues to be taught, told, and remembered because it speaks to something that never ages: the human capacity to choose good even when the whole world pushes in the opposite direction. It became more than a name in aviation history, it became a moral compass. A reminder that as long as there's someone willing to risk everything to save another, the sky will still be a place of hope. And maybe that's why every time a plane cuts through the clouds, someone up there, even without knowing, is flying under the silent shadow of that gesture. The push that proved the impossible has wings. And even after the engines fall silent, courage keeps flying.